Thank you. Thank you very much. It's truly a pleasure for me to be speaking here with one of the people that I most respect in the world. And I think everybody, General Petraeus is somebody who needs no introduction, but I will just note that he was commander of U.S. and allied forces in Iraq, commander of U.S. and allied forces in Afghanistan, commander of Central Command, director of the CIA, and he is also, of course, the author of a book co-author of a book that I highly commend to you called Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, which is truly a historical tour de force.
Actually, it's now to Gaza.
Okay. Now,
Second edition is out.
You
need to update. We'll see you over at the book tent.
And because I've known and been friends with General Petraeus for so many years, I feel that I have the freedom to call him by his first name, which of course is General.
Let me just say thanks. It's wonderful to be back on this stage. It's wonderful to be back on stage with Max. I have known and admired him for decades. I believe his biography of Reagan, which I think he's going to speak about following this, in fact, on which
tomorrow morning, 10 a.m.
Okay,
be here
10
at
a.m. You heard it. Be online. I interviewed him on stage at the New York Historical Site. For that, it is spectacular, but also prior to that, The Road Not Taken, his book about Edward Lonsdale and the opportunities that were missed in Vietnam, all the way back, Savage Wars of Peace, when we were engaged in savage wars of peace, if you will, so-called small wars, although they didn't seem that small to those who were engaged in them. But it really is a pleasure to be here, and I do appreciate the fact that the introduction was so mercifully brief, because the longer version includes reference to the fact that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007 to Vladimir Putin. It also notes that in the fall of 2022, I was sanctioned by Vladimir Putin for my support of Ukraine.
All right, let's get this show on the road. General Petraeus, in keeping with the fact that he is a former general, is going to be scrupulously nonpartisan and non-political, but there's a lot of policy, a lot of things going on in the world that we can discuss. And
I don't even vote. Actually, I stopped voting when I was promoted to 2 stars. I thought the example of General Marshall was a good one to adopt, and that actually puts me in a pretty privileged position, because members of either party will actually talk to me, despite the hyper-partisanship.
You can engage in shuttle diplomacy between them.
That's right.
Well, let me ask you, obviously there's a lot going on in the world, beginning with the massive changes we've seen in Washington, we're only 2 months, a little more than 2 months into the Trump administration, although it sometimes can seem like we're 2 decades in. But President Trump has talked a lot about a America First foreign policy, about reorienting American foreign policy. And what do you see so far from the early days of the Trump administration as far as foreign policy goes?
Well, look, I think every country puts itself first, and it should. It doesn't necessarily have to beat its chest about that fact, because frankly, having commanded the largest combat coalition in history, in Afghanistan, which was over 60 countries, I often was reminded of Churchill's observation that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And allies are important. I think it's very good to see President Trump get the Europeans really serious about the defense of their interests in Europe, especially obviously against Russia, which has brutally invaded a neighbor, denies its very right to exist. All of this part of Vladimir Putin's effort to really reestablish the Soviet Union or even a czarist Russia. I've often thought, Max, that we should have listened a lot closer when Vladimir Putin was asked one time what was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And, you know, you could have chosen World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, any number of truly historic catastrophes, and instead his response was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he really has been trying to put it together again ever since, and we should have paid much closer attention. We also should have been much harsher on Russia in the wake of the 2014 occupation of Crimea and the southeastern part of the country known as the Donbass. Of course, it all began where we persuaded Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons that were still on its soil after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, something called the Budapest Memorandum, where we and the Russians and the British signed that we would ensure their security, and that obviously did not work out really well for them. Look, I traveled an enormous amount. I'm a partner in one of the world's largest investment firms, about $650 billion under management. I chair our Global Institute, which does the geopolitical risk during the diligence process, helps our companies when they run into challenges, and that requires an enormous amount of international travel. I typically go to about 25 different countries a year, many of them more than once. I've already spent a week in Ukraine, my 5th trip since 2022. I was at the Paris AI Summit. I've been in London 4 times alone just this year so far, just came back from India last week. And it's instructive. The reason I mention this is because we tend to get a bit obsessed with ourselves, somewhat understandable. We're the biggest economy in the world, the greatest country in the world in many respects. But it's interesting to hear what others have to say. And the New Zealand Prime Minister was the inaugural speaker at this Raisina dialogue in India last week, invited by Prime Minister Modi. I want to just talk about some of what he said, which seemed to me to be quite profound. In particular, he made the point that past assumptions that underpin the previous generation's geopolitical calculations are being upended, in part because we're all trying to understand what is the foreign policy of the U.S. going to be going forward. It's still quite early on. But he quotes the Singaporean foreign minister, who said the world is now shifting from unipolarity to multipolarity, from free trade to protectionism, from multilateralism to unilateralism, from globalization to hypernationalism, from openness to xenophobia, and from optimism to anxiety. Otherwise, everything's going great. But this is a global change, and we are among the drivers of the global change, perhaps one of the most significant of those drivers, noting that obviously the reason that we have transitioned over the last 12 years, actually from when I left government to today, we have transitioned from a period that could be described as benign globalization, in which economics drove geopolitics. All the barriers to trade, investment, capital flows, data flows were being reduced, and globalization, as measured by global trade, was going up like this. 12 years later, we're in an era of renewed great power rivalries. Most of that is about the rise of China and the further aggressive actions that they have pursued on the world stage, but also obviously Russia's renewed aggression against Ukraine, all the activities in the Middle East, all of which I'm sure that we'll discuss during this time, but also, again, the U.S. embarking on what we're not really certain about yet, because we don't know. I was in India, as I mentioned, and I sat down with Nouriel Roubini. Many here will know and respect him, one of the world's great economists. By the way, I taught economics. I did a PhD at Princeton in a combination of international relations and economics. And we both agreed after an hour of conversation that the most central issue right now about the U.S. economy and perhaps the world economy is whether President Trump is using tariffs just as a threat to get something, and that's a valid use of that. That's how we got Mexico more serious about illegal immigration, to extradite a bunch of really bad kingpins from these criminal insurgencies, which is they're much more than cartels in Mexico and much more threatening, and then also more serious about fentanyl. And she continues, the Mexican president, to do this. The question is that enough, or on 2nd of April, will there really be 30% tariffs imposed on a variety of countries around the world, on the 3rd of April, will there be these threatened 25% auto tariffs? These are big issues. And as Nouriel put it, is Trump escalating to de-escalate? In other words, threaten, but then we're going to cut a deal and it's going to be okay and the resulting tariffs won't be that substantial? Or is it escalate, to impose? And that is the big question right now. Again, I'm in the financial and the investment world, and we're all watching this and trying to divine what is going to happen. The challenge here is, economists don't agree on much. They're always debating endlessly. There's one thing on which all economists generally agree, and that is that tariffs are inflationary, and the higher the tariff, the greater the inflationary effect. And if you couple that with more tax breaks, again, that'll be inflationary. And then if you couple it also with reduction of the growth of the workforce because of limits on immigration, perhaps even a reduction. Keep in mind that we are not reproducing, our citizenry is not reproducing fast enough to continue growth of the labor force. It's in immigration that has enabled that. And then remember that GDP is labor force size, if you will, times productivity. So again, that would be inflationary. Obviously, if you have a reduction, wages will go up and so on. Now, one good news is that we are in an incredible productivity boom right now in the United States. It is so incredible, it could actually offset some of the effects of a slower growth in the in the workforce. But that remains to be seen. But the AI productivity and everything related to that is really propelling us at an unprecedented rate in recent decades. So that's what we're waiting to see. And we just can't answer that until we get there and see whether President Trump is using this as a threat to get something, after which it's going to, that threat will dissipate, or if this is really serious. And the idea is that we're going to reindustrialize in the United States, but that's a very long period that will take. And in the meantime, the challenge will be the uncertainty and the unpredictability and just basic concerns about all this very likely will produce a caution among consumers. Consumer sentiment is already starting to head down. And keep in mind that we're 75% domestic consumption is our GDP. So we're very, very sensitive to domestic consumers, not on exports the way, say, a country like Germany is. And then if there's business confidence is hurt as well, you're going to have a delay in decisions on investment and major capital products. All of this could have very challenging effects. Then you get into a wealth effect if the markets continue down or something. So again, we don't know what is going to happen on the 2nd of April and the 3rd of April. But as I mentioned, countries around the world are already starting to see this. And then I just add that the Prime Minister of New Zealand, he added, we are seeing rules giving way to power, a shift from economics to security, and a shift from efficiency to resilience. And that latter one, you can see that manifest in before, this is COVID related as well, not just the new administration here, but pre-COVID, you practiced just-in-time logistics. You don't want all the parts and components and everything else to arrive and have to warehouse them at great cost. You want them to arrive when you need them, and then you put them right onto the assembly line. Well, COVID, because of the disruption to supply chains, all of a sudden it became just in case, and actually warehouses are back, and that still hasn't given way. But now some of these other disruptions and concerns and so forth are fueling that particular sentiment as well. So I think that's sort of where we are globally. And as I said, it's often good to hear others talk about the world and our country than it is just to listen to what we're saying within the United States.
What do you think the impact has been of the evisceration of, or what do you think the impact will be of the evisceration of U.S. Foreign aid spending, trying to shut down VOA? I know one of your former colleagues, Jim Mattis, once said something along the lines of, if we cut foreign aid, I'm going to have to buy a lot more bullets. What do you think the impact is?
I actually love that comment. You know, Jim Mattis has a great way with words that occasionally got him in trouble. But that was one with which I fully agreed. Actually, it was if you don't get me more diplomats, I think actually you're going to have to get more bullets, whatever. But soft power is how you actually solidify the gains achieved by hard power. For example, in the surge in Iraq, first of all, the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces, as important as the additional 25 to 30,000 troops were in enabling us to more rapidly implement what was the real surge, which is the surge of ideas, a change in strategy, big ideas. You know, a strategic leader, I had this intellectual construct that I used during the surge in Iraq, CENTCOM, Afghanistan, and on. The leader at the very top has got to get the big ideas right, craft the right strategy, has to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to all who have a stake in the outcome of that endeavor, has to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's what we normally think of as leaders. That's the example the leader provides, the inspiration. It's the organizational architecture that he or she develops. It's hiring the best and brightest, hanging on to them, allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the metrics that you use. It's how you spend your time. It's crucial. We call it a battle rhythm, and you have recurring events, activities, and so forth. And on that battle rhythm, there are events and activities that enable you to, or sometimes force you, to perform the fourth task, which is to determine how you need to refine the big idea so you can do it again and again and again. And in the surge, the big ideas were 180 degrees different, frankly, from what we've been doing before. We had been doing clear and leave operations. You go into a neighborhood, you kill a lot of bad guys, and then you leave or you hand off to Iraqi forces who by that time were no longer combat effective. They'd been beaten up so badly or intimidated by the Sunni-Shia civil war. And we decided we're going to have to clear, hold, we're going to stay, build, rebuild, and then over time transition. By the way, we'll talk about this probably relative to Gaza, because I don't think that Israel has the right big ideas for that particular campaign, despite the brilliance that they had in Hezbollah against Iran and so forth. So again, it's absolutely about getting the big ideas right, Max. And in this case, when you make progress with your hard power, so we go back into an area and we stay and we create gated communities and we drive violence down, we use biometric ID cards, what then solidifies what we've achieved in hard power is soft power. It's the provision of humanitarian assistance, restoration of basic services, reconstruction of schools, clinics, markets, roads, bridges, you name it, get the soccer league going again. I mean, there's sort of graduated level of all this, and all of a sudden they have a stake in the success of what it is we're doing, and over time we want them to have a stake in the success of the Iraqis, who then over time we transition control to in accordance with a set of conditions that we have established that are pretty hard and fast. So again, soft power is very, very important. You know, were there areas that could have been cut? I'm sure there were. I mean, we both know government. You know, there was an effort to reduce the size of government in the past, and I think it was actually quite a good template that we should look back to. It was in the late 80s, President Clinton and Speaker Newt Gingrich. Congress was involved from the get-go. They studied all of the departments and agencies for 6 months, identified where they could make cuts, did so. They had the buy-in of the secretaries and agency directors, so they weren't being bypassed. And I think it would be good to reflect on how that went. Now, it's true that President Clinton said the era of big government is over, and it really wasn't, but it was a lot reduced. And by the way, it was in those years that we balanced the budget for the last time, actually that went into the first year or two of George W. Bush, but it was largely on the back of what Congress in some ways forced President Clinton to do, and President Clinton enlisted Congress to help them. And I wish that we could get back to that kind of collaborative effort because it struck me as seeming to be a lot more organized than a bit of what we're seeing right now.
Now you...
I'm a master of understatement.
Yes. Now, as you mentioned, I mean, you obviously oversaw a vast coalition of allies in Iraq and Afghanistan, across the Middle East more broadly, and working with our intelligence partners at the CIA. So, how concerned are you about the strains and cracks in the transatlantic relationship and the strains and cracks in the U.S.-Canada alliance, which at one time was one of the closest in the world? I mean, there are people who are now concerned that NATO may not survive. How worried do you think we should be?
Well, first, I think NATO will survive. The question is if the U.S. continues to lead it as we have in the past. Now, you have to be honest here. There's only one every president, and I served under a number of them at quite senior positions, while they were pushing hard on our NATO allies to do what they should have been doing. We did not get the Europeans sufficiently committed to the alliance that at the end of the day was begun against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and then the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War is Vladimir Putin. And again, they still weren't as serious about it as they should have been, and this president got them serious about it. Now the question is if we're going to then, having galvanized, been a catalyst for that kind of long overdue action, particularly when it comes to Germany, and they've taken a very, very important legislative step to allow them to exceed their limits on budget deficits when it comes to spending on defense. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of euros in Germany alone. Long overdue. But we need allies. That alliance is particularly important to us. We've seen it in the past. The only time the Article 5 provision of NATO has been invoked, this is the collective defense, an attack on one is an attack on all, was in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And they then joined in to the campaigns. All of them were in Afghanistan. Most of them, with some notable exceptions like France, were in Iraq as well. So I'm a strong believer in NATO. I was actually a NATO guy, if you will, as a second lieutenant, an airborne platoon leader when we were part of the Allied Command Mobile Force Land. We're going to jump into Far Eastern Turkey when the Soviets threatened, and I'm sure that our little battalion of guys with rucksacks was going to intimidate them. It was called deterrent patrolling. I guess it was we were going to die for our country to make sure that we were in the war. But then all the way up to 1-star, 3-star, 4-star NATO positions as well, where I was dual-hatted as a NATO commander and also as a U.S. commander. So big believer in it. Big believer in the alliances that are out in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, actually, there's some good action going on out there. Now our Secretary of Defense just concluded meeting with the President of the Philippines and his counterpart, which is very important because the Philippines are sort of the elbow in the first island chain around China and Taiwan. So let's see how that also develops. I'm hopeful that having achieved something that no other president has, that we will then show that we are still essentially the foundation for NATO. Again, our economic power, military power is just unrivaled, and we don't just spend more than all of our NATO allies put together. We spend more than 2-point-something times as much as all of them put together. Yes, that's for the whole world, not just focused on Europe, and that's a distinction we shouldn't forget. But it's really important that the U.S. is the foundation for any NATO operation. No other country has all the capabilities that we have remotely in the number and capacity that we can bring to a fight or to a deterrence mission.
Let's talk about Ukraine. You mentioned just getting back from Ukraine. Now, I believe that our president vowed that he would end the war in 24 hours, and so it's been more than 24 hours. But do you think, in fact, leaving aside the time element, do you think he will actually succeed in ending the war?
Well, I'd be more confident, frankly, if our NATO allies and the U.S. In the previous administration, which I think did an admirable job in responding and leading the response to the invasion of 2022, but then just debated endlessly, just infuriating debates over whether to provide the M1 Abrams U.S. tank. And if we didn't do that, the Germans were not going to provide the Leopard tanks, which are very good, and many European countries had them, but they wouldn't release those other countries to give them to Ukraine, even though they wanted to. and that deprived them of a critical capability from the offensive in the summer of 2022 or 2023, for which we had high hopes and then just did not achieve them. The same with the F-16. There were no more MiGs, which is what the Ukrainians had, available anywhere. We'd scoured all of Eastern Europe that had some left over from Warsaw Pact days. So you had to go to another system, F-16. I remember talking to Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor. I said, Jake, there's no alternative. This is the most ubiquitous platform. We've got lots. The Europeans have lots. They'll give it to them. Start the training, because it's not just about pilots. They have actually very good pilots, but it's about the radar technicians. It's about the avionics guys. It's about this whole system, this family of systems that has to be, it's about 6 or 7 discrete, real serious technical capabilities. And we just delayed, and we never really got them to them in time. The same with the multiple launch rocket system, with the Army tactical missile system. Restrictions on the use of ATACMS on Russian soil, endless. And if we had done that, what we should have been, our goal should have been to change the dynamic on the battlefield, to enable Ukraine to demonstrate to Putin that he could not achieve additional gains at acceptable cost. And that's a very high bar because, or very low bar, because Putin seemingly doesn't care about these losses. As you know, the Russians have sustained 900,000 dead and wounded. 500,000 of those were so seriously wounded or killed that they could not return to the front lines. And he's seemingly unfazed by that, although we do see him bringing in North Korean troops. Now it's apparently up to about 13,000 who have not been, they're not well trained, they're not well equipped, they're not tactically that proficient. They just rush, but they'll follow their orders. The truth is that the most significant distinction about these North Korean troops, besides the fact that they're 3 to 4 inches shorter than their South Korean relatives, is that they have watched huge amounts of pornography. They have never had access to the internet like they have in Russia, and they're making the most of it. So, but again, what I would have liked to have seen the previous administration lead, instead of constantly self-deterring at what fairly early on, it was very clear the Russians were going to threaten use of nuclear weapons, but they were not going to use it. And yet we just wrung our hands repeatedly, and that was very disappointing because there were opportunities to put Ukraine in a position where they could have done just what I achieved, and that would be a position of strength. Probably not going to be able to give them all the capabilities. There's just not enough out there given how heavily outnumbered they are. They're outmanned 4 or 5 to 1. They're heavily outgunned in artillery. But what they're doing now, what is so extraordinary, is they are on the bleeding edge, not just the cutting edge. They're on the bleeding edge of unmanned systems. They produced 1.5 million aerial drones last year alone. They did. Now, they buy a lot of the components from around the world, and then they're throwing thousands of suicide drones at the Russians every day in the front lines. This is the most lethal no man's land in history. And I should note, Max captured this war brilliantly when he described it as the war in which all quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner. Because you have elements of World War I, these trenches, minefields, barbed wire, concertina wire, lots of artillery, all the rest of this. You have Cold War, late Cold War era hardware on both sides. The Russians have lost just about all of their modern armored systems. Again, the lethality of these drones in particular. And then you have cutting edge unmanned systems. And it's not just in the air. You know, the Ukrainians have no real navy. It's all been sunk or captured or tied up at the docks because it'll get sunk. Yet they've sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet. How did they do this? With aerial drones that find the Russian ships when they're in the Western Black Sea in particular, and then their designed, manufactured, employed maritime drones that sink them. And they push the Russians right out of the Western Black Sea into the Eastern, which opens up Western Black Sea for the Ukrainians to be able to export grain. It's hugely important for their fiscal situation. It's also critically important to Egypt and other North African countries who whose food security rests on the export of that. And they're probably 25% of the world's grain exports, not production, but exports. So that's crucial, a real achievement in that regard. This one of these compromises may actually allow them to come back into the Western Black Sea, but we'll see how that works out. As long as they don't start shelling or launching missiles at Ukraine, I guess that would be okay, and they don't go after the ships that are the maritime fleet. The problem is, of course, that the Russians are achieving incremental gains on a daily basis, modest, very modest. They haven't even really, none of them has become really strategic, although there's one, Pokrovsk, that could be important because of the rail and lines of communications that run through it. And they've taken horrific losses in doing this. By the way, now the Ukrainians are also using drones and actually missiles to go into Russia itself. And one reason Russia wants to stop the attacks on energy facilities is not because they've hit every single thermal power plant, hydroelectric plant, and transmission systems around the nuclear plants in Ukraine. It's actually because Ukraine is taking down their refineries and their fuel storage locations with a considerable amount of skill and expertise. So, but they're not in a position of strength the way I wish they were. And I don't know really why President Putin would agree to a ceasefire, given that he thinks that he's continuing to gain, and he has not achieved his goals. Of course, the Ukrainians won the Battle of Kyiv in the first few months. They prevented Russia from seizing the capital and toppling President Zelensky. By the way, talk about a great big idea. And a strategic leader, President Zelensky, remember his first big idea was, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv, and they have. They're still there. And we're going to fight to the death for our capital. And they won that battle. They won the battles of Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv province, Kherson. But then after late 2022, the lines really haven't moved that significantly much. It's not a stalemate, because the Russians are achieving gains, but they're not achieving breakthroughs, touch wood. So will he agree? I just don't know what the incentives for that would be. What we see right now, and even President Trump has concluded publicly that Putin may be stringing this thing along, that he's not as sincere as he expressed to the president.
Wait a second. You're telling me Putin may not be straightforward and honest? I got to think about that.
You might say this, I couldn't possibly comment. No.
What do you think would happen to Ukraine if there is a cutoff of U.S. aid, which in fact happened a few weeks ago briefly, but now even though the pipeline is continuing, and even though I guess there is still intelligence sharing going on, as you know, the last aid package, which was passed in April of 2024, there's a finite amount of stuff in there. It was like $50–60 billion worth of equipment, and most of that has already been delivered to Ukraine. So what happens if there is not another aid package? What happens to the Ukrainian position if they can't count on more support from the U.S.?
Obviously, it'd be much tougher, although I met with the three-star who oversees that for the U.S. and Germany, but he's in and out. He worked for me years ago. There's still quite a bit in the pipeline. But what they did is they stopped the pipeline for a couple of days, as you'll recall. Stopped the intelligence sharing is very, very important. Reportedly, according to the New York Times, it is what is enabling Ukraine to precisely target these locations in Russia, where they've had quite a devastating effect, which is, again, one reason why Putin was actually willing to make a deal on the energy, don't hit each other's energy. Then there's other capabilities that we provide to them. All of that is very, very important. But they don't have a choice. They're not going to capitulate. And if the Europeans ramp up more, they're going to keep on fighting anyway. They cannot agree to an unacceptable ceasefire, I don't think. And I know President Zelensky pretty well, met him a number of times over the years. The big issue here, and this is something that he tried to raise in the Oval Office, probably not the best tactical timing, was the issue of a security guarantee. It all comes down to that. What is it that is going to deter Putin, to keep him from resuming an attack, after 2 or 3 years of taking a knee and rebuilding his forces, which have been so damaged. They don't do armored offensives anymore in the Russian side. They just basically have squads of soldiers. They go across the street, get a new foothold. And this is literally the pace of this operation, because if they put tanks out there, the Ukrainians are going to knock them out. By the way, these drone battalions and now regiments in Ukraine, the country, it's one of the first countries in the world that has not just an Army, Navy, Air Force, it has an unmanned systems force. And I visit, as I said, one of these every time. I've watched them train the drone pilots. It's extraordinary what they do. And I've watched this increasing sophistication of their systems. They're far better than what we produce, and they're far cheaper. So we should be learning. They have a procurement system in which those who design, those who manufacture, and those who employ these unmanned systems are all like this. We have a procurement system that is so cumbersome, and there's so many obstacles in the military-industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to describe it, that we produce yesterday's technology for tomorrow's war, with some exceptions. Drones, when I was privileged to command the surge, unmanned these up-armored V-shaped hull wheeled vehicles, and some others. There were some, Secretary Gates loved to do bureaucratic warfare, and he did it very effectively. But normally, that's not the case in the U.S. They have a system that is producing tomorrow's technology for today's wars, and we really should be going to school on it much more than I think that we are. I'd note there are also land, ground, robotics, and unmanned systems as well. In fact, much of their logistics up and back to the front lines and back from the logistics depots is with unmanned systems. They're remotely driven, because it's so lethal out there if the Russians see you with their drones. And they have pretty good drones as well. They have exceptionally good electronic warfare, air defense, jammers, and all the rest of this. So these little drones that the Ukrainians have, they have 4 different antennas coming off them, because they're going to lose the capability in some of these, and they've got to retain that, obviously, especially if they're the out-and-back ones. They have conducted the first ever completely unmanned offensive. The air systems and the ground systems all were remotely piloted, or they're starting to use algorithmically piloted drones as well, which is the way of the future. We need to transition from what's simplistically a small number of large platforms that are incredibly capable, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, and increasingly vulnerable, especially if you're in the Indo-Pacific theater, to a vast number of unmanned underwater systems, surface of the water, air, ground, outer space, cyberspace, informational, the equivalent, many of which increasingly will be algorithmically piloted, not remotely piloted. So the man in the loop is going to become the person on the loop, the person who designs the algorithm. And by the way, AI will begin, they'll program the algorithms as it goes along, and they'll be learning while they're out there under the water, on the surface, whatever it is. We need to learn a lot more from this. But in the meantime, what we need to do when it comes to Ukraine is we should be doing even more for them than we have been doing, rather than less. And I hope that Congress will recognize that. It's still many months, actually, that I was told that the pipeline's going to be full. And keep in mind that some of this stuff is actually procurement, and that's going to take a while we're really having to dramatically ramp up production, for example, 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition and a variety of others that are being consumed there at rates that we never envisioned for ourselves.
Well, let's turn to your former AOR, your former area of responsibility in the Middle East, and obviously, just recently we had a U.S. airstrikes on the Houthis in Yemen, and then something else happened with that. I saw it was in the news. I wasn't following it closely, but let's just stick on the airstrikes on the Houthis, because if you read the actual signal exchange reported in the Atlantic, there was the Trump officials were basically saying that Biden allowed our deterrence to degrade, and we need to do more, and we're really going to stick it to the Houthis here. And I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that Biden did somewhat allow our deterrence to degrade.
He actually did.
And the Houthis have certainly been have been threatening, have been having a major impact on interdicting commercial shipping in the Red Sea since they began their attacks in November of 2023. But to my mind, what the Trump administration just did with their bombing campaign against the Houthis isn't actually all that different from what the Biden administration was doing. And I guess the question is any of that are all these, the use of U.S. air power and the things that we've actually been doing to a large extent for over a year, whether ratcheting up or down, is that actually going to, quote unquote, solve the Houthi threat?
It depends whether we continue it. I agree with you. I thought that the response was wholly inadequate before. The truth is we should have done something to the Houthis all the way back before they actually took over the capital when I was CENTCOM commander, and we wanted to ping them a couple of times with drones, and I think they might have actually stopped right then. Instead, they were allowed to take over the capital. Also, the Yemeni forces that we were supporting at that point in time proved less than as capable as we hoped they would be, but the government was run right out of the country and ended up in Saudi Arabia. Then the Saudis and the Emiratis got involved, and we should have helped the Emiratis in particular when they had the ability to take the port of Hodeidah, which is the major port in the Houthi-controlled area, which is generally the north, the capital, and to the north, others control, and these are largely Shia, these are largely Sunni. There's a bit more than that. That's simplistic, but we should have enabled the Emiratis to do that. Instead, my recollection is that we put up an obstacle to it. We never shared even all that we should have with them. They and the Saudis finally gave up, and we didn't do enough, I don't think, in response to the interdiction of shipping, which took probably 70% or 75% of the ships that used to go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, largely to Europe, as was captured in that signal exchange by, I think, the vice president, that it should be the Europeans should reimburse us or something like that. In any event, I'm delighted to see the campaign ramped up very substantially. It's going to be very difficult because this is a substantial force. They have a lot of religious fervor. It's mountainous. There's a lot of underground facilities. But we've already taken out quite a few of those targets, and what we'll be able to do is degrade them. You're not going to destroy them unless you actually occupy it, and we're certainly not going to do that. But I'm happy to see a second aircraft carrier task force being moved out there and to see this campaign. Again, something that we should have done, I think, again, much earlier, and actually even in earlier presidencies when the threat was observed.
What about how would you recommend that the administration deal with Iran, keeping in mind, of course, that Iran basically has enough fissile material to build a nuclear weapon anytime they choose to go forward, but they've also been weakened in many ways by the Israeli attacks on their proxies in,
that was very important.
In Hezbollah, but by the loss of the Bashar Assad regime in Syria. Do you think there is, and just in the last week or so, Mike Waltz, for example, the National Security Advisor, has set out a very ambitious objective of getting the Iranians to give up their entire nuclear program, not just freeze it, but to give up all their nuclear capability. Do you think that's a realistic objective? Do you think there is a deal to be done with Iran? Do you think that Israel and the United States should attack the Iranian nuclear facilities now that Iranian air defenses are much weaker than they were in the past?
Let me stop there. Let me answer.
I have a lot of questions.
I'm somewhat sympathetic to the idea of taking out the Iran nuclear program, except that I'm not sure I would do it. It's always, when you roll the iron dice, as Bismarck, I think, referred to the decision to go to war, there's always untoward consequences. And we've experienced plenty of that, obviously, with respect to the wars of the post-9/11 period. And President Obama was fond of saying, and then what? And I think that's a pretty good question. Then what, and then what, and then what? Now, you don't ask it so endlessly that you don't do something, as the Syria red line on chemical weapons turned out not to be a red line. That's very harmful to deterrence around the world, actually. In fact, I was in the office of the Prime Minister of Singapore when that episode took place, and he said, General, that reverberates out in the South China Sea. Keep in mind that deterrence, and what we want to do is deter China in particular, that's the number one task, is a function of two elements. The potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and we need to transform those as I've described, but we're doing that, and your willingness to use them on the other hand. And President Biden, I think rightly, seemed to slip up 3 or 4 times and say, of course we'll defend the Taiwanese. His national security advisor would then rush out and say there's no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity. But the message was it helps to strengthen deterrence on that second asset, determination. So if you want to deter them, you got to be conscious of what you do elsewhere in the world. Now, with respect to Iran, even the Iran nuclear agreement, which was quite considerable for 10 years, the problem was that there were sunset clauses, as you'll recall. That was the weakness. Even that didn't get rid of all of the nuclear material. It got rid of all the anything above the sort of the basic enrichment, and 95% or more of that had very open ability to inspect and so forth, quite intrusive. I don't think they're going to give up all of it. But again, if this is an opening bid and not conceding stuff right off the bat, which we've seen a little bit of with respect to Ukraine, then okay, give it a shot. I think President Trump actually is not somebody who likes to start wars. I think he wants to end them. That's what he has tried to do. He's shown, I think, the courage to take some extraordinary activities. In his first term, he killed the 20-plus year head of the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, something about which I shed no tears. He was my most formidable opponent over all the time that I was in the Middle East and then in the CIA. He never dared set foot in Iraq in those days. That was a big blow, and that helps restore deterrence. I think they would like to negotiate. And again, probably with the same sense of, okay, we could take out their nuclear program, and it's great that the Israelis were so successful with their F-35s that we provided them against the sophisticated Russian S-300 air and ballistic missile defense system, because that was a big concern of ours. Keep in mind that we developed the plan to destroy the Iran nuclear program. When I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, we actually rehearsed, this is all publicly known, we rehearsed it one time in the United States, flying all the distances that the aircraft would fly, some of which come all the way from the U.S. and fly out nonstop, refuel in flight repeated times, carry out their mission, and then recover somewhere in the region or back to the U.S. In a way, I'd sort of like to take advantage of this opportunity, but I think, again, you just don't ever know where that goes. And it's a much bigger operation than just taking out the nuclear sites. You have to take out all the air and ballistic missile defenses if you're going to put manned aircraft in there. You have to take out their retaliatory capability. Good on Israel that they reduced dramatically the ability of the Iranians to manufacture solid fuel rocket engines. They took that down from several a day to 1 or 2 a week, which was a big achievement. This is all in response to the second Iranian attack from their soil on Israel. And it's great to see Israel dramatically degrade the capabilities of Lebanese Hezbollah. You know, the supply chain operation with the pagers is one for the history books. We did a lot of supply chain operations when I was in various positions, including my last assignment in government, but never on the scale of this. This is thousands of pagers. It was a sign that you're important to have a pager. And they initiated the explosion by sending an encrypted message, and to decrypt a message on that pager, you had to use both thumbs. So think about where that is when it blows up. So it didn't kill more than a few dozen, and Israel had already taken out something like 18 or 19 of the top 20 leaders of Hezbollah. It actually wounded very seriously thousands of the leaders, and then the next day, their final means of communication, the walkie-talkies, blew up. Another brilliant. I mean, this is better than the Trojan horse. And then the Israelis carried out a very intense air campaign and probably reduced what was, at the beginning of the war, 150,000 missiles, rockets, drones, and so forth that they could throw at Israel to maybe 10, 15, whatever it might be now, and much less capable of using them. Keep in mind, by decimating the leadership, not just decapitating it, and then removing their means of communication, they prevented the Hezbollah fighters and leaders from carrying out what we feared most against Israel, which was an attack of many thousands of missiles, rockets, drones simultaneously that could overwhelm even the sophisticated air and ballistic missile defense of Israel, of Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, Patriot, THAAD, and so forth. And that was a big concern. And that allowed them then painstakingly to carry out this very intense campaign. And that led Hezbollah to agree to ceasefire negotiations and a deal that they never would have even considered prior to that. That then changed the dynamics in Lebanon to where they were actually able to elect a president, the right guy, after something like a year of wrangling, and then to get a speaker for the parliament, which had been wrangling over as well, not the preferred candidate of the Hezbollah Shia bloc, which is great. And then the Lebanese armed forces able to do something never before, which was to deploy down to the area between northern Israel and the Litani River, 25, 30 or so miles. That's the area in which Hezbollah had the rockets that were being launched into northern Israel, forcing the withdrawal, the citizens, probably 65, 75,000 Israelis from their home villages, and had not been able to go back. That was a huge achievement. You mentioned also the fact that Syria, the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime, that they're overthrown by HTS, this a Sunni Islamist organization that had been allied with al-Qaeda but broke away. I should just note that the leader, al-Shara, was enjoying the hospitality of a U.S. detention facility during the surge in Iraq. But, you know, we have hopes here. And I hope that they can create a government of all the people, ensuring minority rights, not just majority rule. Touch wood on that, and that it doesn't become another Libya. But what the significance of this is that Bashar al-Assad was an ally of Iran. He allowed the Iranians to ship, they would go through Iraq, through Syria, and then down into southern Lebanon to Hezbollah. And that means now that Hezbollah can't be reconstituted at the pace that otherwise would have been the situation. So that's a huge achievement. And we mentioned already what they've done to Iran, responding to Iran's first and second ever attacks from their soil. The challenge, candidly, is that with respect to Gaza, I don't believe that they have the right campaign design, the right strategy. I agree that they should destroy Hamas, that's their first objective, that they should keep Hamas from governing again, and that they need to get the hostages back. The problem is that their campaign has not achieved that. They have done enormous damage to Hamas, certainly their infrastructure, killed probably 10, 20,000 of them, but they've been able to replace those losses. Now, they can't replace all the rockets and all the other sophisticated stuff or rebuild the infrastructure, but they're still quite a formidable guerrilla or insurgent force. They're not organized companies, battalions, brigades, combat effective the way they were at the start, but they are still there. And what made the humanitarian assistance during this latest ceasefire work well is that Hamas was overseeing it. Hamas is the organization determining which hostages. So there's still there's no kind of organized government the way that Hamas led before, but they're still the guys with guns in the largest numbers, so they're still going to be the predominant force. And then they've gotten a number more hostages back, but I think they've reached a point with them that any additional hostages there will be conditions that Israel just cannot accept, such as completely leave Gaza and not come back, and also give up control of the southern border of Gaza with Egypt, under which, in tunnels, and through which, in the Rafah crossing, used to flow so much of the military assistance that made the Hamas the formidable force that they were. I would add that there should be, so I agree with those three objectives. The problem is they just haven't achieved them yet. And I believe that there should be a fourth objective, which is to provide a better future for the Palestinian people without Hamas in their lives. And that's really important. There are parallels here. Gaza is far more difficult, especially because of the 350 miles of underground facilities and infrastructure and tunnels, far more difficult than Fallujah, Ramadi, Baquba, northern Baghdad, all of them put together. But there are distinct parallels. Before we went into Fallujah the final time and did it right, we told the people of Fallujah, we are going to make your lives better by getting al-Qaeda out of your lives and keeping them out. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to come in and we're going to clear every building, floor, room, cellar in your neighborhood. We're going to put walls around it, which we could do very quickly every night. and then we're going to have one entry control point. You're all going to get biometric ID cards. The Israelis are phenomenal at biometrics, and we're going to control that. And then we're just going to rinse and repeat all the way through your city of 300,000 people, having first put a wall around the entire city. You have to go to draconian levels. Now, that's what I think should be done in Israel. I know there will be many, many people who say Israel should not reoccupy Gaza, including Israelis. But if you want to achieve the objectives that I've laid out, not just the last one, but the first three, you can't do it without clear hold, build, and ultimately transition to Palestinian security forces, Arabs that help, NGOs, contractors, et cetera. So I've laid this out for the previous Minister of Defense a number of times. He got fired in part because he kept asking the Prime Minister, what is your desired political end state, which is the right question, and it was never answered. I believe, again, it should be a better future for the Palestinians in Gaza without Hamas in their lives. Start in the north, come a kilometer in, put an east-west wall. It's only 8-10 miles wide, very narrow territory. A couple of north-south walls. You have 3 gated communities. You clear painstakingly. You give biometric ID cards to those who belong. Now you have security. And as Max remembers, there was an iconic figure in the Vietnam War, John Paul Vann, who repeatedly would say, security may be 10% of the problem or 90% of the problem. Whatever it is, it's the first 10% or the first 90%. Without security, without that security foundation that I described earlier when talking about Iraq, that you then solidify with the soft power, having achieved this with the hard power, again, without security, you don't have anything. And security has not been established in Gaza. Again, a lot of Hamas have been killed, a lot of damage to their infrastructure and civilian infrastructure, but they have not achieved security. And this is the only way that you're going to do that. And I think if they explained, if they added that fourth objective, if they said they're only going to stay as long as is necessary to transition to trained, equipped, and vetted Palestinian security forces, et cetera, you actually could persuade European critics of Israel in particular that this is a worthy approach. Because without this, if you're just going to keep clearing and leaving, you're just going to have to keep clearing and leaving. And that is just not a formula for a better life for those people without Hamas in it.
But isn't the fundamental problem that Isn't the fundamental problem that Prime Minister Netanyahu basically cannot say that he is ultimately going to turn over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority or to some other Palestinian entity, because if he did that, he would lose the right-wing partners in his coalition, which keep him in power, and which also, by the way, allow him to fight the corruption case in which he has been indicted.
No, there's no question about the dynamics and the political in the Knesset. In fact, that very same right wing said, if you don't resume operations, we're going to leave the coalition. So he's on a real knife's edge. Every now and then you find a political governmental leader who actually takes a bold action and lays out what I think is pretty obvious, the right path that they should pursue. Can they never allow settlements there or anything like that, but paint an actual vision of what it is that they want to achieve, put out the right big ideas and persuasively communicate them, and then effectively oversee their implementation.
Well, that is a tall order, and I hope that decision makers in Israel are listening to.
So was the surge in Iraq, and we had a president who courageously did not listen to his advisors, who all wanted to just throw in the towel and leave, and instead decided that he was going to actually add forces and pick a new commander and a new ambassador, the great Ambassador Ryan Crocker, the best diplomat of his generation, and then backed us wholeheartedly. The unprecedented 7:30 to 8:30 weekly meeting, video conference of the National Security Council. Nothing happens before 9 or 10 in the White House, especially on a Monday morning. This is a Monday morning, and he went immediately to the ambassador and me. And he empowered us to do something that was exceedingly difficult, but drove violence down by nearly 90% in 18 months with our great young men and women on the ground, our coalition partners and the Iraqis, and then it was sustained. It continued to go down, as you know, for another 3.5 years until our final departure. We shouldn't have left fully, and the Prime Minister of Iraq undid some of what we'd done and allowed the Islamic State to reconstitute.
Well, I have many more questions I want to ask you and many more things we can talk about, but sadly I see our timer drawing down to zero. So I think at this point I should simply thank you not only for your insights, but also for a lifetime of service to the country.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.